Mark worked a demanding job as an ambulance driver. He had witnessed countless tragedies, but every life he saved gave him strength and a sense of purpose. That day he had just finished his shift when a strange sound from the ambulance engine caught his attention. It didn't seem like a routine issue, and with vehicles like these, reliability was critical. Mark immediately reported the problem to the hospital administration. Due to their busy schedule, they asked him to take the ambulance to the contracted repair shop. Wanting to lighten their load, Mark agreed and set out after his shift. The weather was cold and snow was falling heavily. The roads were icy. Focusing on the steering wheel, Mark thought, I should get the tires checked too while I'm at it. As he passed by a park, he noticed a woman leaning against a wall. One hand rested on her stomach while the other gripped her phone. She looked distressed. She held the phone to her ear, listened for a few seconds, then glanced at the screen again before suddenly collapsing to the ground. People nearby quickly gathered around her. Seeing this, Mark pulled the ambulance over to the side of the road. He hurriedly grabbed the stretcher from the back and ran to the scene. With the help of the crowd, he carefully placed the woman on the stretcher. Just then, a woman pushed through the crowd, exclaiming, "I'm a doctor." She added, "I'm an obstetrician," and immediately began assessing the woman's condition. Without hesitation, Mark invited the doctor into the ambulance and sped toward the hospital. But the strange engine noise grew louder. Mark wasn't sure if the ambulance would hold up. Meanwhile, the doctor was carefully examining the patient, rummaging through the medicine cabinet. "She's bleeding and her pulse is dangerously low," the doctor said, her voice urgent. "We need to get to the hospital right away." She prepared an adrenaline injection and asked Mark, "How much farther?" "We're running out of time." Mark pushed the ambulance to its limit, but the worsening engine sound amplified his anxiety. As they neared their destination, the tension reached its peak. The doctor, acting swiftly, administered the injection to stabilize the pulse. It helped slightly, but the tension inside the ambulance remained palpable. Without taking his eyes off the road, Mark kept repeating to himself, "Hang on, we're almost there." Mark managed to get the ambulance to the hospital. As soon as the doors opened, the emergency team carefully wheeled the stretcher inside. The pregnant woman was struggling to breathe, her pale face telling the whole story. Obstetrician Emily followed them without a moment's hesitation. Mark stood by the ambulance, feeling like his breath had been knocked out of him. His job was done, but his mind was in turmoil. Shoving his hands into his pockets, he began to pray for the woman and her baby. "Please, let them both survive," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the hospital's glowing lights. A while later, Emily came out to meet him. The tired expression in her eyes spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation. "How are they?" Mark asked, his voice trembling slightly. Emily took a deep breath and said, "She's experiencing severe bleeding. The baby is also at risk. But you're lucky you were there." Every second counted. Her eyes shifted to Mark's worried face. "If they make it, those few seconds will have made all the difference." Mark pressed his lips together and nodded. "If you hadn't been there, I wouldn't have known what to do. Even though the ambulance gave us trouble, we couldn't have managed without it in a situation like this," he said, then added, "I really hope they both pull through." "They need to." Emily sighed deeply. "It's been a tough night," she said, then extended her hand. "By the way, I'm Emily." Mark shook her hand with a faint smile. "Mark," he replied. For a moment, her warmth seemed to ease the tension. Mark turned back to the ambulance. "I can give you a ride back," he offered. Emily shook her head. "No, I'll wait here. They wouldn't let me into the operating room, but I can't leave without knowing they're okay," she said. Mark nodded in understanding. "You're right," he said quietly. He climbed into the ambulance and turned the key. The engine roared loudly, followed by a thick cloud of smoke rising from the hood. Mark quickly shut off the engine and jumped out. Emily followed, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God. We really dodged a bullet. We could have broken down on the road," she exclaimed. Mark paused, watching the smoke rise from the hood, then turned to Emily with a thoughtful look. "You know," he began slowly, "if I hadn't decided to take the ambulance to the shop today, I wouldn't have seen that woman. Maybe everything happens for a reason." His words hung in the air like a whisper, lingering in the silence. Emily said nothing, but her eyes reflected deep contemplation. They both fell silent. The quiet seemed to freeze time under the hospital lights. Mark, trying to push down the storm of emotions inside him, finally said, "I'll go let them know to call the repair service," and walked slowly toward the building. Emily watched him go, pondering how fragile life could be, as if walking a tightrope. The smoke from the ambulance's hood began to fade, but the marks that night left on their minds would remain vivid for a long time. Shortly after Mark reported the situation, a mechanic arrived and began repairing the ambulance. Mark returned with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Emily, who was still anxiously watching the doors of the operating room. "No news yet, I guess?" he asked. Emily took the coffee, inhaling deeply. "Looks like it's going to be a long surgery," she said without taking her eyes off the doors. At that moment, a doctor in a blood-stained coat emerged. Emily rushed over, her voice shaky with worry. "I'm Emily, the obstetrician," she said, fear evident in her eyes. "Did I make a mistake giving that injection?" she asked, trembling with guilt and anxiety. The doctor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No, it was the right call. Without that injection we would have lost the mother. You saved her life." Emily exhaled deeply, her tension easing slightly. "And the baby?" she asked, a flicker of hope in her voice. The doctor's expression softened as he lowered his head slightly. "The baby went without oxygen for too long. It's critical. We've moved the baby to the neonatal intensive care unit, and the doctors are doing everything they can. Let's hope for the best." Emily's gaze drifted into the distance, unable to process her emotions. Mark noticed Emily's shock and confusion. Quietly, he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said to the doctor on Emily's behalf. The doctor offered a faint smile. "No, thank you. The mother's life was saved because you got her here so quickly. It was your swift action that made the difference," he said before walking away. Tears streamed down Emily's face. The joy of saving the mother mixed with the fear for the baby, creating a storm of emotions in her heart. Suddenly, Emily turned and hugged Mark tightly. Mark, momentarily taken aback, returned the embrace. He knew how deeply these events had affected her, but he sensed there was something more profound beneath the surface. Mark guided Emily to a nearby bench, offering her the coffee. She took a small sip, her breathing slowing as she tried to calm herself. Without waiting for her to speak, Mark began. "I've been an obstetrician for 3 years," she said, her voice trembling. "Early in my career, I saved a mother with an emergency intervention, but we lost the baby. I've never forgiven myself for that. I've carried that guilt for years." Mark could feel her pain. He nodded in understanding and shared his own story. "Once, in the heat of the moment, I took a wrong turn and got a patient to the hospital a few minutes late. That patient didn't make it and I blamed myself for their death. But later, I saw on the news that there had been a major accident on the road I was supposed to take. It took me a long time to realize, but I learned that some things are beyond our control. It's fate." Looking into Emily's eyes, Mark continued, "This isn't your fault. You did everything you could. The mother is alive, and if the baby pulls through, it'll be because of you. Think about the ambulance. If we hadn't been there, none of this would have been possible." He gently placed his hands on her cheeks, his gaze steady. "You did your best." Emily, still tearful, seemed slightly relieved. Mark hesitated for a moment but then hugged her again. Her warmth and resilience deeply moved him. He realized that this strong and courageous woman wasn't aware of her own strength. Mark felt a profound connection, recognizing that this moment had forged an unforgettable bond between them. Mark set his coffee aside and turned to Emily. "It looks like it'll take some time to hear news about the baby," he said softly. "You'd know better, but—" Emily gave a small nod. "Yes," she replied calmly. "We won't get updates right away. They'll need to carefully monitor the baby for a while." Mark hesitated for a moment before voicing his concern. "You'll wear yourself out. Maybe you should go home and get some rest," he suggested, his eyes fixed on her weary face. Emily immediately lifted her head, her gaze firm and unwavering. "No, Mark," she said resolutely. "I can't do that. I wouldn't be able to sleep anyway. I'm too worried. Plus, I want to check on the mother. I'm not leaving. But if you want to go, I'd understand." Mark considered it. He could leave. He'd be back at the hospital in the morning anyway. But he didn't want to leave Emily alone in this state. Deep down, he realized there was more to his decision, an unconscious but growing desire to stay by her side. With a gentle smile, he said, "No, I'll stay too." Emily's eyes briefly flickered with surprise, but a sense of calm soon washed over her face. Though she didn't admit it, Mark's decision brought her a deep sense of relief. His presence kept her from feeling lost in her loneliness and anxiety. Mark's steady demeanor, paired with the warmth beneath it, had captivated her. They sat in quiet companionship, sipping their coffee as time moved slowly under the dim hospital lights. But in that silence, an unspoken bond grew stronger between them. Emily felt a profound gratitude and trust welling up in her heart, making her feel stronger than she had in a long time. Meanwhile, Mark realized how much comfort Emily's presence brought him, wishing for this moment to stretch on forever. A man in a suit with a worried expression approached them. His eyes were tired but carried a flicker of hope. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Are you the doctor who saved my wife?" Emily nodded gently. "Your wife is improving," she said. The man exhaled deeply, but the fear in his eyes remained. "I know," he murmured. "But there's still no news about my baby." His voice cracked, his anxiety evident. Mark placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "Don't worry," he said in a steady tone. "The baby will be okay too. They have a strong mother." The man looked at Mark, tears brimming in his eyes. "You're the ambulance driver who brought her here, right?" "I can't thank you enough," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Mark lowered his head modestly. "I was just doing my job," he replied. Emily added softly, "We both were. It's our duty." The man nodded, his eyes welling up. "But thanks to your efforts, my wife is alive," he said, offering a heartfelt thank you before walking away. As Mark and Emily watched him leave, they felt the weight of his desperation and fear. Silently, they both offered prayers for the man and his family. Time dragged on slowly, the tension of waiting palpable. Yet, through the shared quiet moments, Mark and Emily grew closer, their bond deepening despite the worry and sadness they both carried. Hours later, a doctor emerged from the neonatal intensive care unit and approached the baby's father. The man's entire being was focused on the doctor's every word. Mark and Emily, holding their breath, watched the moment unfold, their hearts pounding in unison. The doctor placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder and smiled. "Congratulations, you have a beautiful baby girl," he said warmly. The man couldn't hold back his tears as he murmured, thank you so much." The doctor continued in a calm, encouraging tone, "She's a fighter. She held on and made it through. Her breathing is now stable and she's a healthy baby. She'll need a few days here to rest, but once we're sure she's strong enough, you can take her home. Your wife is also recovering well and will be staying here to regain her strength." Relief and joy spread across the man's face, his happiness unmistakable. Mark and Emily exhaled deeply upon hearing the news, their faces lighting up with pure relief. They embraced each other, their hearts filled with peace after such a tense night. The man approached them, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough," he said sincerely, pulling an envelope from his pocket and holding it out. "Please accept this. You saved both my wife and my child." Mark and Emily responded simultaneously, "It's our duty," then exchanged a glance. Their synchronized and heartfelt reply underscored their shared values and mutual understanding. When the man insisted, Mark gently suggested, "How about donating this to the hospital?" He glanced at the check and noticed the substantial amount. Hospitals often need additional ambulances. As a driver, I know how crucial that is. Just a suggestion, of course, he added with a calm smile. If this story touched your heart and you enjoy witnessing life's little miracles, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more. Each new story will take you on a unique emotional journey. The man looked at them in astonishment. Emily nodded approvingly, her smile supportive. "That's a wonderful idea," she said. The man, clearly moved, remarked, "It's hard to believe people like you still exist." After a brief pause, they all agreed to donate the check to the hospital together. A little later, the doctor returned, smiling. "The mother and baby are now in the same room. You can see them," he said. The man quickly followed the doctor, but before entering he turned back and called out, "You should come too." When they entered the room, they saw a beautiful baby resting peacefully and her mother lying in bed, exhausted but smiling with gratitude. The mother looked at them and said softly, "Thank you for everything." Emily approached her gently. "Don't worry, you have a wonderful baby girl. You're both going to be just fine," she said reassuringly. The parents exchanged a glance and then the father, beaming, said, "We've decided to name her after you. Her name is Emily." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she smiled, her voice unsteady with emotion. The gesture held a profound significance that words couldn't express. For a while, Mark and Emily stood quietly watching the family's joy from the doorway. Then Emily gently took Mark's hand. They both recognized the miraculous beauty of the moment. This day had marked not only the survival of a family but also the beginning of something new. Hand in hand, Mark and Emily left the hospital, marveling at life's unexpected miracles and the connections forged through them. Sometimes, life's toughest moments pave the way for the most beautiful beginnings. If this story moved you and you'd like to hear more heartfelt tales, support us by subscribing to our channel. See you in the next story.